Today we're summarising the first book of Kings, with that now finished, and I think largely it's very similar to the Samuels in the sense that it seems a lot like a largely historical account, albeit it is much faster in the sense that it covers an awful lot of generations in actually quite a short book. It does, though, contain some really interesting big concepts, perhaps the most interesting of which is this idea that now we don't have David around, we've got his successors, and they're, I suppose, sort of measured against David. David is still held up as God's favourite, despite the fact that he was a pretty bad man, wasn't he? I mean, he got up to some pretty dodgy stuff. So it's interesting that his devotion to God seems to have him seen in God's eyes as being the better king than someone else who perhaps didn't sin quite so much. The trouble with that, of course, is that the Bible is written in this really odd way that just misses detail and just skips from one sort of fact to the next, to the extent there are many of them are facts. So we don't know for a fact that Solomon was sinless. It just seems he was pretty sinless and pretty well behaved. It certainly seemed more well behaved than David, right up until the point where suddenly it emerges he's got 1,000 wives and concubines and he goes off with other gods and he's gone a bit crazy. So it seems that Solomon was the better man than David, because at least he didn't seem to be stealing people's wives by getting the husband deliberately killed in order to do so. And yet the book of 1 Kings seems to fairly clearly demonstrate that David is seen by God as the superior king, despite being, well, seemingly the more prolific sinner. We had already established that to obey was better than to sacrifice, albeit that's kind of problematic in a current age where seemingly God isn't doing anything very overt, so how can you obey something if there's no instruction given? So I guess that option isn't open to us. But it seems perhaps we've also established in the book of 1 Kings that devotion to God is better than being sinless. The obvious problem with that, if that were true, of course, is it suggests that you could potentially be a little bit of a twat and still get away with it. To be fair, David did get his punishment for his wife stealing, or some of his wife stealing at least, and husband murdering. So it seems that getting away with something in the biblical sense is not quite the same as getting away with something in the earthly sense. Therefore, for anyone who thinks there might be a God or thinks there is a God, it doesn't seem like a good strategy to go around trying to rely on devotion over sinlessness. We also have several instances where people had categoric proof of God's existence and then still went on to be total punks. Example is Jeroboam, when he did his sees him, point with his hand, and his hand shriveled up, and then he changed his mind, his hand went back to normal. And King Ahab with his god off that he loses very badly. And they both went on to follow fake gods, so it doesn't make any sense. I just can't wrap my head round why someone would know for a fact that that was true and then go off and do something counter to that. It seems blatantly, obviously asking for trouble. Another thought that occurs is actually that somewhat flies in the face of what my understanding was from the book of Genesis, that God wants us to have free will and to choose a connection with him, whatever that means, and to make his existence overtly obvious would sort of somewhat be to the detriment of that. That possibly sounds a bit silly, but if you envisage a situation where someone has a gun to your head and then they're telling you to choose what to do, you can choose what you want to do or you can choose what they want to do. I mean, yes, strictly speaking, you still have a choice in that scenario, but realistically everyone's going to choose to do what the person with the gun says so they don't get their brains splattered all over a slightly wonky bookshelf. That concept seems to make it unlikely that God would make himself overtly obvious, which sort of agrees with the situation we have today, as far as I'm aware. And yet we're told that he did make his presence overtly obvious to a few people, which doesn't make a great deal of sense. And furthermore, that those people then went on to be total punks even after they'd had their proof, which makes even less sense. Obviously, there has to be some evidence that the Bible is real, so perhaps that would account for why God might strategically make his presence overt at some stages. But you would have to say that for anyone in the great fortunate position of having God reveal himself to them, to then go on and not mend their ways would have to make them among the dumbest people who've ever lived. Tied into that as well, we have this idea of that God isn't in the earthquake, the wind, the fire, but is in the whisper, which, I don't know, in my head seems to suggest that perhaps he's saying he's not going to be overt, he's going to be subtle in the way he operates. And I guess that would tie into the Genesis idea that it doesn't make a great deal of sense for God to particularly over-announce himself, as it were. Whether that's just of its time, perhaps, is another matter, because not that long ago we had God throwing 10 plagues at Egypt and splitting the Red Sea, apparently specifically in order to be overt, to prove his existence. And in sort of 800 years' time or so, there's a guy who's going to come back from the dead, again, very overt. So it seems that God being in the whisper is not a blanket condition for all time, because sometimes he does seem to be very much in your face. I guess it's just debatable whether or not that's a good thing to be around for that or not. I suppose if he is real, it would make sense that it would be a good thing to be around for that. But alas, that is not the situation we seem to find ourselves in today. The balance between those two seems to strike quite an interesting equilibrium. If I take myself, for example, then I live in an age where God is not doing anything particularly overt, as far as I'm aware. So it's like the metaphorical gun is not to my head, so I can choose whether I want to be a punk or not. But at the same time, we've got all this history and stuff that's happened, the plagues of Egypt and the bits of the Bible that are theoretically evidence for God's existence. So I can sort of theoretically investigate whether it matters how I live my life or not. I quite like that. That seems like a reasonable way that a God who wanted us to choose him and the right things generally to set up a universe. All that being said, there doesn't seem to be anything in the book of 1 Kings that offers itself as evidence. So I'm still treating this as just context and assuming that any evidence will come from somewhere else later on. If anything, actually, thinking about it, for the idea that Jeroboam and Ahab would have had proof of God's existence and then gone on and lived other bad lives seems so unlikely that it perhaps suggests that even if the book is otherwise broadly historically accurate, perhaps God's great reveals has been embellished slightly, maybe. I think I'm going to stop doing the recap of each book and what I've learned from each one, partly because it's getting very, very long. But overall, as a brief summary, I think we've at least established the idea that God created humans in the hope of our choosing him, which we picked up from the book of Genesis. He's not going to hold that metaphorical gun to our head by being overly in your face, which again is also sort of Genesis, but backed up by book of 1 Kings. He is trying really hard to give us the chance to do what we're supposed to be doing, which would seem to be the book of Judges. He's told us what we need to do, how to do it, and what will happen if we don't in Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers, and I suppose a bit Deuteronomy. We also know that there's a big, large-scale, long-term plan going on, because we've got this talk of this guy Jesus coming in, well, he didn't name Jesus obviously, but it sounds like Jesus in nearly 1,000 years' time. So, God's pretty patient. But yeah, so with what have we got? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, first book of Kings. With those all now done, hopefully in the right order there, we will move on and see what we can find out next.